the Middle podcast, the podcast dedicated to the music, movies, and culture of Generation X.
What is up, slackers, and welcome to another episode of the Stuck in the Middle podcast. I am your host, Jason Eck. And this week, I was thinking about some sitcoms, family sitcoms. But as I was thinking about them, I was considering if I remembered them first run or if I was remembering them from syndication. So you have to have 100 episodes, or at least this was the standard, 100 episodes before a show could be syndicated. So that was kind of this rarefied air. If you got the 100 episodes, then you would go into syndication. But here's what I realized. So I've mentioned a few times on the show, many times in fact, that the cohort of our generation, Generation X, does, span a fair amount of time. So the different metrics would be everything from either 64 or 65 to 77 to 78, somewhere around there. So for me, I am, just under mid 70s, right? So I'm 74. And if you were someone who was born in 64 or 65, by the time I come around, you're 10 or 11 years old. So you're at a different place, not only developmentally, but what you have for a memory of these time periods. So if you're born in the 60s, you have a much clearer kind of picture of the 70s. Now, for me, I still have memories from the 70s, the sights, the sounds, the smells, but also the television content. So this is where my brain was going. Okay, do I remember these shows, syndication or not? And what I realized is, I had done the episodes about cartoons. Now, beyond Saturday morning cartoons and things like Mr. Rogers, like the PBS stuff, Sesame Street, those kind of things, if you were watching television at 8 o'clock in prime time, it's whatever was on. So sitcoms would have been what you watched. Didn't matter if you were 5 years old or 15 years old. That was primetime television. And that's what we watched. Either as a family or just, I've mentioned before that I am a card-carrying member of the Latchkey Kid Club. Sometimes I was just watching TV. So that's where it hit me. Even as young, 4, 5, 6 years old, I was watching these shows. Which means that if I'm born in 74, 79, I'm 5 years old. So I started thinking about those shows. So with the exception of a couple, most of these shows went from the 70s into the 80s. So that's really the topic. These shows that carried over between decades. Now, I don't think my kids care as much about the concept of decades as we did. Like when there was a changeover from, the 70s into the 80s, I did the Dick Clark episode. I think now that I look back on it, it was definitely 79 into 80 was the time that I was allowed to stay up that first time at my grandparents' house because it was the decade changing. The 70s were over, and now the 80s were a new time. I mean, a lot of this was somewhat overlapping with things that were happening in society and history, the Cold War, all of it. So I'm like, gosh, some of these shows I would have watched as a very little kid all the way to just about within a year or two of my going to high school. That was a mind blower. So I'm just going to go with the one that I only very minorly remember as far as when it was on, like first run. And that would have been the last season of the show. Now, the reason that this really is reinforced into my head is because of a magazine, one of the Scholastic type magazines. So I'm talking about Good Times. So Good Times, Jimmy, J.J. Walker, Estelle Roll, John Amos. So Good Times ran from 1974 to 1979. Now, I clearly remember being in kindergarten and going to the library at my school, Jonathan Trumbull School. And in the library, they would have the magazines, the Scholastics. But one of the magazines that was pretty popular at the time was Dynamite. Well, actually, it was called Dynamite. But, Jimmy Walker always said, Dynamite. He was on the cover, and he's wearing like a Kango, just looking cool as hell. Excuse me. And that just sticks in my head all these years of Jimmy Walker on the cover of this magazine. So I mostly saw that in syndication, after the fact, but definitely that last season, I remember watching it on television with my family. So next up is All in the Family. Now this blew my mind. So this started in 1971, before I was even born, and ran until 1983. So I would have been 9, and it's etched in my brain. But I realize that most of what I watched was not All in the Family. Rather, it was Archie Bunker's place. So Archie buys the bar down the street. So after, Ethel? Is that her name? Oh, gosh, it's Archie and, oh my gosh, Jean Stapleton. How am I not remembering this right now? The dingbat. When she passed away, not in real life, by the way, she left Edith. When she left the show, wow, she got 3 Emmys and 2 Golden Globes for Best Actress. Absolutely deserved. Really, when you saw her out of character, it was amazing what she was able to do. Described as the perpetually optimistic and devoted wife of Archie Bunker. So they killed her off when she left the show. So Archie ends up buying the bar, and it becomes Archie Bunker's place. Danielle, oh gosh, what is her name? Whenever I try to do this stuff by memory, this is what happens. That is the niece that comes and stays with them. That's kind of the era that I remember. Danielle Brisbois. That's the era that I remember of the show. So Archie Bunker's place. So not even, the main All in the Family, because it ran for so long. I mean, it's a 12-year run. Technically, the last couple years were a different show, but it's still Archie being Archie. And of course, there was the spin-off show from All in the Family, and that was the Jeffersons. So the Jeffersons, I didn't realize this either, ran from 1974 to 1985. That's a really good run, particularly for a spinoff. But Sherman Hemsley, was a crazy good comedic actor, so good. What was her name? She was the housekeeper, and then she went on to, oh gosh, yeah, it's been a crazy week, and I didn't get in anywhere near as much. Maria Gibbs, right? Maria Gibbs, Marla Gibbs, yes. Oh my gosh, holy cow, Marla Gibbs is still alive. She is 91 years old. She received 5 nominations for Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Supporting Actress for Florence. Well deserved. And then, of course, Lenny Kravitz's mom was Roxy Roker, and she was the neighbor. And the whole thing is, when you read the write-up about the show, there were multiple characters, 2 different relationships, where they had a interracial couple on TV, which before that had been, for the most part, taboo. So to then have that be just a critical element of the supporting cast was well ahead of its time. So again, all the Norman Lear stuff, so the All in the Family, the Jeffersons, etc., were really exploring things that were happening in society, but doing it in a really funny way, which is playing up and directly going at the stereotypes. And I think that is kind of the piece of comedy and comedy writing that is sometimes misunderstood, because it gets looked at as being purposeful or malicious, as opposed to recognizing that, the poor attitudes, the negative attitudes, or the bigoted attitudes of an Archie Bunker or a, Mr. Jefferson. I mean, that was what they were pushing against, George Jefferson was also bigoted, just as Archie was. And they almost hit it off because of their own bigotry against each other, that somehow they became kind of strange bedfellows and kind of, appreciated each other. So very interesting. But all of those shows did touch upon serious things, everything from gun violence and alcoholism, racism, suicide. Some of the language that was used was really pushing the envelope of what was being done on TV. But that show had such a run. I mean, 85 to 85. So I'm 11 years old. And it's so ingrained in my memory. So just a shout out to that whole cast. They were so good. And Sherman Hemsley, he had, a couple other shows that came later in the 80s. There was one that he was a preacher. So he was also, amen. Of course, he's a preacher. Of course. I think one of my children is printing to the printer that's down here, but homework needs to be done. So, excuse the noise there. And then Marla Gibbs was on, I keep forgetting which apartment number it was, but she was in, 227 with Jack A. So, such legendary, sitcom comedy actors that had multiple vehicles that were relatively successful. 227 ran from 1985 to 1990, on top of already having that, 10-year run on the Jeffersons. That's 15 years just killing it. So good for her. Yeah, that started in September of 1985 after the Jeffersons ended in 85. So pretty amazing. Pretty amazing. So now here's where we get into the Gary Marshall verse, and something that I think that everyone that's in that mid 70s back through the early, 60s, mid 60s Generation X feel very, very much at home with this particular set of shows. These are ingrained, I think, in our DNA, in our memories. The Gary Marshall shows, of course, starting out with Happy Days. Happy Days started in 1974 and ran to 1984. Of course, it had a number of spin-offs. But that first season was filmed very differently. So it had all the laugh track stuff, but it was like filmed. It was filmed as though it were, I don't think there was a studio audience. Like, it wasn't done on a soundstage in the same way. I mean, obviously some of the stuff at the home was, but like all the exterior stuff at Arnold's, it looked very different. And then there was Chuck, the older brother. What happened to Chuck? Chuck just disappeared. But even like how they sat at the table is a completely different configuration, where the front door was. I guess they were all in the same place, but looked so different. So they retooled it. I guess after the first season had kind of it came out of the gate really hot, but then it cooled down. So that's when they had to try to revamp it, reformat it. So of course it goes more to the traditional sitcom style. And of course you have the introduction. Now, I guess he started in the first season, but as far as really becoming a integral part of the show, Arthur Fonzarelli, of course, played by Henry Winkler, the Fonz. It's kind of amazing to see the man Henry Winkler outside of the character. Just this kind of like dorky, kind of slight guy. He was so cool. The Fonz was so cool. And part of it was because Henry Winkler is a all-around performer. I mean, he did that whole dance number, like crazy stuff, but the Fonz was the be-all, end-all. Everybody wanted to have a leather jacket. Everybody wished that they could go up to, the jukebox and just hit it with the side of your hand and boom, it's going to play the song that you want. And he was always lucky with the ladies. And he was also kind. And he was secure. And that was very cool because he was older than the other guys because they were all in high school and he was out of high school. He's a dropout and a mechanic. He ended up going back, getting his GED, getting his degree, becoming a teacher, a shop teacher. Beautiful. Of course, the cousin of Chachi Arcola. Was it uncle? Nephew? Anyway, that was the be-all, end-all. Fonzie was the man. Now, Richie was the main character, but when Richie left the show, it was all about Fonzie. And then you had, Fonzie gets married or engaged, and, Heather O'Rourke comes on as like his stepdaughter. Of course, the show ends. The big culmination of the show was Joni and Chachi getting married. Of course, with their spinoff, Joni Loves Chachi. But I mean, I remember that final episode of Happy Days. That was must-see viewing. So for people who are older than me, let's see, what year? Because I remember, because I just remember where we were staying at the time. Holy cow. Here's one that I forgot. It wasn't on my original list for tonight. How'd I miss this? MASH. MASH ran from 1972 to 1983. I remember everyone on Earth. Final episode of MASH. Final episode of MASH. And I think for the longest time, it was the most watched finale of a show up until Seinfeld. Gosh, I didn't even think about that. What a great show. But again, also touching upon very serious themes. I mean, you're setting this in the backdrop of the Korean War and very serious situations, and the levity, which was meant to be also true to life. Because if you don't have things to laugh at, if you don't have humor when you're in that environment, I mean, humor as a coping mechanism for what they were experiencing. But yeah, MASH, that ran from 83. Gosh, I mean, I was 9 years old. I remember that being such a big deal. I'm not sure I watched it because I'm not sure what time slot that was on. Because that's another thing as I'm looking through. It's the phenomenon of primetime television and in that time and era, but also my particular upbringing, which had less restraints than others. I realized I must have been up late a lot, even pretty young, and that primetime block is like 8 to 9. But some of the shows that I watched were definitely on at 9. So it must have been like 9:30 would have been pushing it. And some of the shows that were on at 9:30 were definitely much more risque. And we'll touch upon some of those. But certainly going back to the Gary Marshall stuff, Laverne and Shirley. Well, just very quickly on Happy Days, you end up having, this is kind of like the sequence of events. There's a pilot. There was a Happy Days pilot. And somehow George Lucas got to see it, right? And it was there that he saw, Opie himself, Mr. Richie Cunningham, Mr. Ron Howard, and said, oh, this kid's great. I want him for my movie, and put him into American Graffiti. Now, the only reason that's notable is that guys like George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, they were the new filmmakers at the time. Ron Howard was so intrigued by the process of making movies that really he left Happy Days at its height to go be a director. And he's become a very serious and well-respected director since then. So just kind of a quick aside there. But, I mentioned on one of the episodes, you have, Donnie Most and Anson Williams as Potsy. Tom Bosley. Great stuff. So this spun off to Laverne and Shirley, right? Penny Marshall, Cindy Williams, let's see, Lenny and Squiggy. That was Michael McKean and David Lander. You had the Big Ragu, Carmine Ragusa. Was it Michael Mecca But I think the most memorable thing is probably Lenny and Squiggy. You know, hello, Laverne. I loved those guys. Michael McKean is such a legendary and diverse comedian. I mean, mostly comedy, but he's done a number of different things. But everything from Spinal Tap with, Rob Reiner to, all that stuff with, who's the director who just does all these weirdo films? But nevertheless, what a great cast. Pepsi and Milk, still not a thing. Disgusting. I know that, Shirley had that cat. What was the cat's name? Mr. Whiskers or Mr. Meow or something like that. That was also like a big deal when that went off the air because Shirley Feeney was not on much of the final episodes. It was basically all about Laverne DeFazio, who's obviously, Penny Marshall is the sister of Gary Marshall, and she also became a well-respected director in her own right. And the other show that can't be forgotten, which is a spinoff, other than, Joni Loves Chachi, is, of course, Mork and Mindy. Now, I only really clearly remember the last couple of seasons, which, of course, introduced Jonathan Winters as Mork and Mindy's baby, right? So Mork from Ork, of course, played by the legendary Robin Williams, Pam Dauber as Mindy, folks like Tom Poston, who is, I think, most well-known for the Newhart Show. But yeah, Jonathan Winters, because those from Ork age backwards. So they're hatched out of an egg looking like a older person, and they gradually get younger. However, their mannerisms are that of what we would consider a baby. So it's Jonathan Winters playing a big baby. That was my, last couple of seasons of watching Mork and Mindy. So for me, I don't really remember much of the will they or won't they with Mork and Mindy. You know what I mean? I really remember them mostly being in a relationship, getting married, having Jonathan Winters as their baby. But kind of a cool show, like the opening, or I should say the closing, really it's a monologue. So it's Robin Williams talking to Orson. Mork to Orson, come in, Orson. What is it, Mork? And he would give a kind of recap of what he'd learned about, humans from his perspective, because he was meant there to observe. He's supposed to observe humans, blend in and find out their culture and what makes them tick. I think ostensibly for a future invasion, if I remember correctly, but no, they're quite wonderful, blah, blah, blah. So Mork and Mindy, killer. I got to say, I had a pair of those suspenders, those rainbow suspenders that he wore. Everyone had to have those. Those were very, very sweet. And I did get a set of those. I wore suspenders. Like, just in general, I wore suspenders during that time period. I mean, how many people still wear suspenders? I mean, I probably would if I could pull it off. But I think I'm at the age now and kind of the body shape that I'm at now that I'm just screaming like, what was that Cajun? The Raging Cajun, the guy who was the cook. Oh, yeah. Gosh, how did he talk? I don't know. It was always like a little dash of this and a little dash. Oh, yeah. All right. So here's the one that I think this was on at 9:00, but I remember that as I was getting older, I was kind of viewing the show differently, like picking up on some of the more subtle humor or not so subtle humor, but was going over my head. And I started to go, that's what they're talking about. And I'm talking about Three's Company. So Three's Company, that ran from 1977 to 1984. And then the spinoff show with Jack, which was Three's a Crowd from 84 to 85. That didn't go over very well. But I remember the introduction of Don Knotts into the show. So I think that if you're of our age, you saw in repeat often the Andy Griffith Show, or at least I did. But then also like the work that he did with like Disney, like the Amazing Mr. Limpet, whatever it is, the Apple Dumpling Gang, like Don Knotts being introduced into the show as like this 70s to 80s swinger was just hilarious. But yeah, I mean, you had Suzanne Summers, who was kind of like the breakout star, I think, in a lot of ways. You had Joyce DeWitt as Janet, and you had Jack Ripper, obviously, John Ritter, who tragically just died suddenly during the filming of 10 Rules to Date My Daughter. I think that's the name of it. Anyone who is a fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, John Ritter did an episode where I think he's like a android. So good. So good. So underrated in a lot of ways. Because he didn't really do a ton as far as dramatic roles, except he was actually very, very good and could do it. I think, that's right. He was in Sling Blade and Bad Santa, which was his final live action movie. Don Knotts called Ritter the greatest physical comedian on the planet. Wow. That is great praise. Yeah, and his final roles include voicing the title character of Clifford the Big Red Dog. Yeah, 8 Simple Rules. That was the show. Which, I mean, he did that for... Yeah, it was 3 seasons, I guess. It was renewed for a second season, and he died suddenly. Yeah. Gosh, but such a legend. But of course, the big controversy was with Suzanne Summers, who said that she wanted to be paid fairly. She wanted to be paid fairly. And that was just not something that the producers felt that wasn't really warranted for her. So you had Jenna Lee Harrison for a short time as Chrissy's cousin Cindy, and then Priscilla Barnes was through the remainder of the show. But of course, they were also talking about some taboo topics as well, in particular that the only reason that Jack could live there with the girls, because, that was not allowed. So the Ropers were the original landlords, and they're like, you can't live here with women. Oh, sure, it's no big deal. I'm gay. And that was like a big thing for the character. And I think at the time that was pushing an envelope. I mean, let's see, what did I say? 1977? That was certainly pushing an envelope, even through the 80s. So yeah, interesting show. And of course, there was his buddy Larry. And Larry was definitely kind of like the sleazy buddy who was, oh, hey, come on, Jack, let's go have a good time. So they were certainly going ahead and balancing out that he is pretending to be a gay guy because his buddy Larry Dallas, which is Richard Klein, was over the top with the machismo. Yeah, I just remember that spinoff show being dreadful. Like, it was like supposed to be exciting. It's like, oh, we're getting a spinoff. Like, the show's not going off the air. Three's Company is still alive. Look at Jack in this new life. And not so good. Not so good. Oh, gosh. This was a show that you're not supposed to be a little kid and want to smoke, right? Little kids are not supposed to smoke. And they're certainly not supposed to go ahead and get their little candy cigarettes. And we all had the candy cigarettes. Tasted like chalk. But I used to roll one up in the sleeve of my T-shirt because I wanted to be like Snyder. That's right, Snyder. I'm talking about One Day at a Time. Bonnie Franklin, Valerie Bertinelli, Mackenzie Phillips, Pat Harrington, who was, Schneider. It was, for me, that show was interestingly relatable. I didn't have siblings at the time, but it was a divorced family. And that was something that I was experiencing. Single mom, growing up in an apartment building. And yeah, it was very, very relatable. I think so many people totally crushed on Valerie Bertinelli. And it was just like, when Eddie Van Halen, it was like, oh my gosh, Eddie Van Halen's with Valerie Bertinelli. Like that was crazy at the time. because she seemed like such a good girl and he was bad boy Eddie Van Halen. But yeah, Three's Company. Pretty simple, straightforward show. I think I recall the last couple of seasons, maybe Bonnie Franklin wasn't on there anymore, and it was mostly about the girls, or really mostly about Valerie Bertinelli and Schneider, I guess. But yeah, I always like to roll up the candy cigarettes in my arm. Yeah, 1975 to 1984. So I would have been, 10 when the show was going off the air, but Valerie Bertinelli was a huge star. And it's just like the grocery stores, the tabloids, the Globe and the National Enquirer and the Star. I mean, all of these actors, they were the ones on the cover. Those were the stories that they wanted to get. So the next one, I only very, very vaguely remember it because I was little. It was on the earlier side of my memories. Okay. And I don't remember much of it, but part of the reason that I think it resonated with me was because of Richard Mulligan. And I'm talking about Soap. So, Catherine Hellman was in that, Billy Crystal. So, I mean, there were so many memorable performers that were on there, but I don't fully remember it. I just remember it having like the same kind of cliffhangers that my mom and my grandma had with their sitcom, their soap operas, because it was meant to be a play on the soap opera. It was a satirical look at it. It was a sitcom, soap opera, and it would have these cliffhangers, and I think it would freeze at the end. So really more of a distant memory, not so much deeply into the story. I do know that Billy Crystal's character, so again, for primetime television in the 70s through early 80s, Billy Crystal's character was, openly gay. And that was like a big deal. What, Jody, I think was his name? But what really stands out, of course, is the spinoff. So Soap ran from 1977 to 1981. So that's okay. That's a good run. But their butler left, Robert Guillaume, Benson, and Benson ran from 1979 to 1986. That, I don't know. That blew me away. I'm like, that started in the 70s, 79 to 86. So, I mean, 86, I'm 12 years old. I remember that show so clearly. And of course, Dee Conn was on that show, who, for much of our generation, she was known for Benson and Grease. And Grease 2, the better of the Greases. I said what I said. Nevertheless, Benson was a great show. So that was what, Missy Gold? Yeah, because the other Gold was on Jason and Maggie were Growing Pains? Yeah, Growing Pains. Yeah. I think it was Growing Pains, right? With Kirk Cameron, right? Isn't that? Now I'm second guessing myself here. Alan Thicke. Yeah, Growing Pains. I don't know why I doubted it. Yeah, Dr. Jason Seaver. It's still just a kick to me that I'm Jason. My wife is Maggie. Jason and Maggie. Anyway, so Benson was a classic. That was that's how I got there, because Missy Gold was on there. And let's see, it was Melissa Gold, Tracy Gold, who's over on Growing Pains. Yeah, I had kind of a crush on Missy, not so much on Tracy. Okay. So next, again, I didn't know that this show was on as late as it was. Talking about Alice, which ran from 1976 to 1985. So again, like firmly entrenched in my memories. So that's Nancy McKeon, who will be coming up shortly. Her brother, who was Alice's son, So let's see, Alice, trying to remember the names of the actors. And Linda Lavin. I know Linda Lavin. Mel, oh boy. I was going to say Mel Torme, and that's definitely not it. And I just spelled a couple of things wrong here. So let's see. Alice. Where did it go? Television. Alice, American TV series. Linda Lab, Vic Tayback. Oh my gosh, I was calling him Mel. Vic Tayback, Beth Howland, Philip McKeon, Polly Holiday. Polly Holiday, of course, was Flo, whose catchphrase was everywhere. And this is how you told someone, without swearing, where they could go. You can kiss my grits. That's a great line. I'm bringing back Kiss My Grits. That's a good one. That's a great one. But obviously a story of a widow. She's driving with her son, and I forget how, but they just kind of, the car breaks down. And she just takes a job at the diner, Mel's Diner, there in Phoenix. And they just stay there. And that's where she begins to work. Yeah, so Mel Sharples, Flo Castleberry, and Vera Louise Gorman. So Vera, the neurotic and scatterbrained Beth Howland. Yeah, but to 85. Did not know that it went so late. Paul, there was a spinoff, Flo. Flo leaves to take a hostess job in Houston. Oh, well, yeah, because you go from server, well, waitress at the time, to hostess. Makes sense. Interesting. Very curious. But yeah, I mean, Alice ran for, it changed production companies or network? Huh. It did. It changed networks. Yeah, there's a few shows on here. So it ran, no, it says CBS from 1976 to 1985. 202 episodes for 9 seasons. That's a great run. 9 seasons. Holy cow. 202 episodes. I don't think I've seen that on anything. I should check the streaming services because, I'm sure it's very dated, but some great performers there. So now we have a show that I think many of us relate to for a lot of different reasons. And I think part of it is because it was kind of the example of the child star. And we kind of saw the trials and tribulations and the challenges that many of the actors on this show went with or experienced, particularly after the show ended. But it gave us many, many catchphrases. Not even many, just really one really big catchphrase. So if Flo had one with Kiss My Grits, then certainly Gary Coleman had one as little Arnold Drummond. What you talking about, Willis? I'm talking about Diff'rent Strokes. Diff'rent Strokes ran from 1978 to 1986. 1986. So again, I'm 12 years old. I remember, I think it was on Wednesday nights because I went over my dad's house like every Wednesday and alternating weekends, right? So I wanted to watch Diff'rent Strokes when it was on. And it was so interesting to see that growth of, little Arnold, and seeing him in his teens. Of course, we're looking at, Conrad Bain as Mr. Drummond Dad. You had Dana Plato. What was the name of her character? Obviously, Willis, played by Todd Bridges. Diff'rent Strokes. And then we'll get to another character in just a minute. Kimberly. So Dana Plato was Kimberly. Her life completely derailed after the show. She did a Playboy shoot and was trying to go the risque route and alcohol, drugs, like the whole thing. Todd Bridges also was really struggling with drugs in particular. I think that he ended up getting his life together. Yeah. Yeah, he is 58 years old. Wow. It's not that much older than me. 65. 1965. Like I said, Todd Bridges, he is one of us. He is a Gen Xer, man. That's so freaking rad. I don't know. I didn't realize that. And Gary Coleman, who unfortunately did pass away at the age of 42, 1968. 1968. So two firm Gen Xers, and Dana Plato right on the cusp. 1964. Passed away in 1999, at the age of 34. Just tragic. But when the show started, you had their, what is it, the housekeeper or their cook? Housekeeper, right? Mrs. Garrett, Mrs. Edna Garrett, who then spun off when she took on the job of the house mother at Eastland School for the Facts of Life. So like I just said, Diff'rent Strokes ran for 8 seasons, 189 episodes, gets a spinoff. And then the Facts of Life ran from 1979 to 1988, 201 episodes, 9 seasons. I remember watching both of them clearly, but Charlotte Rae, you had Lisa Whelchel, Kim Fields, Mindy Cohn, Nancy McKeon, John Astin's kid, Mackenzie Astin. That's all John Astin's kid. That's also, oh my gosh, identical cousins. Oh my gosh. Molly Ringwald was on the Facts of Life. I don't remember that. Oh, I remember George Clooney was on there. Mackenzie Astin, 1973. Let's see here. Kim Fields, 69. It is so crazy. Like, they're part of us. Like, they're our people. These actors in these shows. That is just, I didn't even think of doing that with some of the earlier episodes, because I feel like so much of them were adult or adult oriented, or the actors who were playing teenagers, like on Happy Days, were not teenagers, but the Facts of Life, here's a little trivia note. One of the co-writers of the theme music, you take the good, you take the bad, you take them both, and there you have the Facts of Life. There's a time you got to go and show you're growing now. Alan Thicke was the composer of that song, a co-composer. That's right. When Charlotte Rae did she leave? Yeah, she left the show and she was replaced by Cloris Leachman. And then, of course, like I said, George Clooney, he had, it was like the Facts of Life and like, what is it? Killer Tomatoes from Outer Space or whatever it is. Like that was his career. It's like it was going, nowhere until ER. And then From Dusk Till Dawn, but I'm meandering a bit. So I do have a couple of honorable mentions, only because I do remember them, but only very, very vaguely. Very vaguely. So Barney Miller, which ran from 1975 to 1982. I remember mostly the last 2 seasons, but Hal Linden, Ron Glass, oh gosh, who was the other guy? Wachowski? Fish was on there, Abe Vigoda, also, from The Godfather. It just, I don't know, there's something about like the whole backdrop with like the cell in the back, and they all have their offices, and I don't know, it just really stands out and very, very memorable. Yeah, Max Gale. Yeah. Oh gosh, did I get this right? Wojo Howitz. Yeah. Interesting. But yeah, I just only really remember that very little. Like I said, latter days of the show. Of course, Ron Glass was in, Firefly. Good stuff. And then the other kind of honorable mention, and it was one of the ones that I definitely did watch in syndication, but I clearly remember because of a babysitter, right? So I had a babysitter who was really into Def Leppard. I'm talking about like Pyromania, Def Leppard, right? That era. And I think that coincided with like the end of Taxi. And that's just, I don't know why that is something that like sticks in my head. So let's see, that was 83 was when it went off the air. Pyromania was 1983. Wow. I just kind of stoked my own brain with that because those two things are so linked to me. And looking at the time frames and how they line up, that is so unbelievable. Very, very cool. But like the big thing with Taxi was like there's kind of a star power that was there, right? Because of the cast. I mean, Tony Danza, of course, went on, and not on this because it didn't start until the 80s. I actually think it started in 1980. That's Who's the Boss. But Tony Danza was a huge star. Jeff Conaway was in Grease. Mary Lou Henner. I crushed on Mary Lou Henner. Just so much. But like Christopher Lloyd, I mean, within 2 years of Taxi was Doc Brown in Back to the Future. Judd Hirsch, he had this other show. I forget what it was called. Was like he a psychiatrist or something like that? I don't fully remember. I know it was on for a couple years afterwards, but let's see. Taxi. Oh, Dear John. Dear John. Yeah, that ran from 88 to 92, 90 episodes out of that. So just short of reaching the criteria for syndicated show. And of course, the late, great Andy Kaufman as Latka Gravith. The Latka thing was so at odds with him, like just all the character work that he did. But whenever he did a character, he was just fully in it. Like amazing to see a lot of the work that he did. And again, as a wrestling fan, the stuff that he did with Jerry Lawler down in Memphis is the stuff of legends. And of course, Louis De Palma, Danny DeVito, writer, director, I mean, everything. He's done it. Danny DeVito. And also a huge Mr. Bungle fan. Like a Mike Patton fan, to be sure, but Mr. Bungle. Danny DeVito. It's my boy right there. But then there was a couple of guest stars, like Carol Kane was Latka's, interest. Or was that his wife? Simca and Latka. And they both sounded the same. And then what was that character he had? Johnny something. Oh my gosh. Reverend Jim made me cry in one of those episodes. In one episode, Vic Ferrari. Latka was an adaptation of Kaufman's Foreign Man character, which he originated in his stage act. In his act, Foreign Man claimed to be from the fictional island of Caspiar in the Caspian Sea. Kaufman, feeling that he had lost control over the character he had created, eventually grew tired of the gag, leading the writers to give Latka multiple personality disorder. This allowed Kaufman to play other characters, the most frequent being the repellent, smooth-talking lounge lizard persona, Vic Ferrari. And then, of course, he becomes Alex, with profound insights into Alex's life. Just as he's about to reveal to the real Alex the perfect solution for all his problems, he reverts back to Latka. So, anyway, that's more of an honorable mention. Again, a murderer's row of great talent that came out of that, and they all went on to big stuff. So just really impressive and kind of a great show. But the reason I said that Christopher Lloyd made me cry. So Reverend Jim is, of course, kind of a burnout, I mean, he admits it, and he had a pretty good time back in the 60s, and, you know, acid and all kinds of things. And he'd had a falling out with his family. And when his father passes away, he sends him, or he gets this trunk, and his father writes a note, and, you know, he takes out the record player and he puts the record down, and, you know, he drops the needle onto it. And, You Are the Sunshine of My Life from Stevie Wonder. And Jim just sinks into his chair and cries. And it's just so intense and beautifully, beautifully acted. So Christopher Lloyd, kind of underrated for some of the things that he's done in his career, particularly in that moment of drama. Just so poignant and so powerful. So anyway, those are the shows that I can only describe as being the decade, the carryover in the decade from one into the other. The shows that lasted from the 70s straight on through the 80s. The shows that were early formative parts of my life. Now, for some of you, that may have been your, you know, like adolescence into teens. For some of you, you might not remember any of these shows at all because it was just slightly behind you. I just know that all of these were just critical parts of my viewing habits. And what's interesting is that I watched a lot of TV. And honestly, I don't watch much television anymore. Like if I'm watching something, I tend to binge like YouTube videos of various different subjects and topics, or I'll watch one singular series when it comes out, but then nothing else interests me. So just so interesting that we have all of these channels, like with the Bruce Springsteen song. And I find so few of the shows that appealing that can hold my attention. So when we're looking at these shows that are lasting for 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 seasons, was it just because there was less competition? Or is it because they were actually really good? I think it's a little bit of both. I think that the shows lasted because they were well written, well acted, well performed. And I also do think there's an element that there was just less content on. So these shows, if they were good, lasted for really good runs. At some point, we'll dig into the shows that are firmly of the 80s. But I just wanted to go to those shows that were in my earliest years, the 70s into the 80s. Just very interesting time in history and in television. Probably an interesting time in music as well. But I did do the 1979 episode, so you can go check that out. If you'd like to, it's right over here on the podcast. So what shows did I miss? I almost missed MASH. So I'm sure there are some others that I may be missing. So please let me know. And how can you let me know? Of course, you can email me at stuckinthemiddlepod@yahoo.com. You can find me on Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube at StuckPodX. You can head on over to the Facebook page, Stuck in the Middle, a Gen X podcast, where right now I have a poll up of 4 different topics. Please go out there and give me your vote of which topic you'd like to see most in an upcoming episode. Please like, comment, share. Please leave 5-star reviews, positive comments. Gosh, I guess you can also leave negative comments if you feel like you would like to, as long as you still give me a 5-star review. You can even give me a negative comment with a 5-star review. That'd be great, because all these things go ahead and help the show become visible and grow. Most importantly, of course, please subscribe to the podcast. So, until next time, later, slackers.